God's purpose is for all organizations to serve as faithful images in the world. God intends for all organizations to image the Trinitarian DNA in their internal relationships and also in their external relationships to the world. God has commissioned you to participate in that faithful imaging. But the fall has meant all organizations are also fallen. Along with ways your organization is faithfully imaging God, there is false imaging happening also. In order to recognize the fallen aspects of your organization, look for mutations of the Trinitarian DNA. The Babel story reveals the nature of organizational sin. It's like a virus that will mutate interdependence to forced dependence, overflowing love to self-focused love, and shared purpose to corrupted purpose. This means that as you participate in those internal and external relationships, you will encounter organizational sin. And it's precisely in those places of organizational sin that God is inviting you. God is commissioning you to intercede for the organization, prayerfully pointing the organization back to Jesus the Redeemer. When people experience the fallen aspects of an organization, they often reach a critical point in their progress toward commission. This is where people are tempted to stop or even turn back on the journey. Consider your experience of your organization's sin. Isn't that when things feel painful and frustrating? That is probably when you feel most alienated from your work. The impact of any kind of sin is to cause people to feel disconnected from God's purposes and go backwards in their spiritual growth. Organizational sin is no different. For instance, I have noticed that for people in the committed stage, when they encounter some really painful form of organizational sin, that is when they are most tempted to go back to a consumer relationship and think, it's just a paycheck. I'm not going to care too much. The goal for this session is to keep you connected to God's purposes in a fallen organization. Organizational sin does not have to be an obstacle in our spiritual growth. In fact, it is an opportunity. This opportunity exists because of an important piece of good news from Scripture. God's purpose in the world includes redeeming fallen organizations. Remember, Jesus has reconciled all things back to himself, transforming institutions from false images to repaired images. And you are invited to participate in God's plan for redeeming Babel. So let's go to the end of that Babel story, which explained the prototypical fallen organization. By the end of the Babel story in Genesis 11, Babel has been infected by the virus of organizational sin. It then spawns a multitude of entities that together are called the nations. The nations spread throughout the earth, each with their own land, language, and culture. The nations are a critical part of Scripture, especially in the Old Testament. By my unofficial count, there are 523 references to the nations as a timeless category of being. I'm not even including references to particular entities like the Philistines, Cushites, Ammonites, and Babylonians that existed at particular historical moments. References to the nations are found in every major type of Old Testament literature. In terms of timeless categories of being, only God and Israel occur more frequently than the nations. This frequency should alert us that the Old Testament is not just a story about God and Israel, as the Old Testament is commonly described. Rather, it's a story about God, Israel, and the nations. The nations occur so often in Scripture that it's actually easy to skip right by this term and not stop to ask, what is this term actually referring to in our world today? I think that most Christians have only a fuzzy picture in their heads of what is meant by the nations. Many readers imagine that the nations just refers to lots and lots of people as disaggregated individuals or as a generic term for all humanity. Or if readers do imagine some organizational entity, They may imagine our modern conception of the nation state. However, both of these imaginative translations are not fully accurate. The term the nations certainly means something more institutional than just lots of people as a mass of disaggregated individuals or as generic humanity. The Old Testament has other words to describe those realities. Imagining the nations as the modern nation state isn't quite correct either. The particular entities that fly national flags, have a centralized government, a professional standing army, legal citizenship, laws, and so on, are a relatively modern invention in human history. The nation state of our modern imagination did not exist in the times of the Old Testament. To understand what the Old Testament means by a nation, we should examine what a given nation provided its members in the ancient Near East. When one reads the Old Testament, we see three key things that a nation provided: cultural identity, means of production, and security. Cultural identity is a complex thing that includes race, language, lineage, norms, and more. But a shortcut summary is that cultural identity is what you most often use when introducing yourself to people who don't know you. Cultural identity is whatever you use to identify yourselves to strangers who need some way to place you in their minds. This is why in the Old Testament, whenever a new character is introduced, they invariably are described as so-and-so the Shunammite, or so-and-so the Philistine, or the Ammonite. The nation is the thing that identifies who you are to others. For most of you, I suspect that when you first introduce yourself in social and professional contexts, the affiliation that you will most likely use is not your national citizenship or all the different languages you might speak, but rather your organizational affiliation. It will be where you work or where you go to school or some other organizational identity. Suppose you just met someone and wanted to find out more about them. What would you do? You might look at their LinkedIn profile or some other online bio. What is featured prominently in those bios? Their organizational lineage, the companies where they worked, schools where they got their degrees, and so on. We identify people by their organizational affiliation. In our era, our organizations provide our cultural identity. Another key aspect of the biblical conception of a nation is that it was the entity that provided people with their means of production. In the Old Testament context of farmers or herders, that meant land. Which nation you belonged to defined what kind of land you had access to. For most of you today, your means of production is not land, but rather things like equipment, intellectual property, facilities, legal authority, and capital. In our society, these means of production belong to organizations. Ever since the legal invention of the corporation several centuries ago, it is organizations that legally own the vast majority of productive assets in the world. So how you produce and which resources you have access to is defined by which organization you belong to. Finally, in the Old Testament world, your nation provided you with security. Your nation was what protected you against hostile invasion or raids. It also was the last line of defense against economic catastrophes like famine. In our modern age, some of the most important aspects of your security are provided by your organization. For example, it is your company that pays your salary, provides your health insurance, and funds your retirement plan. The stronger your organization is, the more secure you are likely to feel. So the first key tip for today's session is that whenever you read a passage in Scripture about the nations, imagine secular organizations. You should be imagining organizations of all kinds, like corporations, nonprofits, and schools, the very institutions where you are wearing your organizational hats. Those secular organizations are the nations of today. The three major character types in the Old Testament story are God, Israel, and the nations. Since the nations are the equivalent to secular organizations of today, we know that the nations are also fallen organizations. Fallen organizations have mutated the Trinitarian DNA so that they are imaging God falsely. The Old Testament has a very specific term to describe when organizations image God falsely. It's called idolatry. Idolatry is literally imaging God falsely. Looking at the instances of the words idols or false images in the Old Testament, and then comparing it to the nations, we can see a strong correlation. Whenever Scripture describes God's concern for the nations, it is often describing God's concern for how the nations are acting as false images, how they are practicing idolatry. In the Bible, idolatry is rarely described as just the personal behavior of an individual. It's almost always described as the institutional behavior of organizations, whether it was the behavior of the nations or how Israel itself had been infected by that false imaging. This leads us to the second key tip for this session. When you see idolatry in Scripture, think organizational sin. Idolatry is just the biblical term for organizational sin. And you can discern fascinating connections between particular forms of idolatry and particular institutional practices. For instance, several biblical verses refer to the idol that the Babylonians worshipped. It was an image of the god Marduk. Looking at this picture of the idol of Marduk, can you guess how Babylonians characterized God? If you guessed that they imagined a character of violence and force, you were correct. The Babylonian Empire did not characterize God as a set of interdependent relationships like the Trinity. Instead, the Babylonians' image of God was a classic case of mutating interdependence to forced dependence. The internal relationships of the Babylonian gods were marked by constant conflict, where one god sought to forcibly bring the others into subservience. The victor of this god-on-god violence was Marduk, who murdered some of his rival gods to intimidate the others into submission. In the Babylonian version of creation, Marduk slits open the belly of one of his victims and uses the innards to create mankind. Quite literally, mankind is created to image forced dependence. And not surprisingly, in the Babylonian creation story, mankind is meant to serve as slaves to the gods, to carry out menial tasks that Marduk does not want to be bothered with. Since the Babylonians imaged their god as practicing forced dependence, we can predict what its institutional practices were like. It should be no surprise that the Babylonians' empire's relationships were characterized by one form of forced dependence after another. The empire was built by those in power forcing its own people into slavery, and then externally defeating other nations to force them into slavery. Idolatry and institutional practices go hand in hand. The false god of an organization will translate into its own code of behavior. The point of equating your organization as a nation and your organization's sins as idolatry is actually to give you hope. You should feel hopeful because if your organization is a nation practicing idolatry, then this means it's part of God's redemption plan. In Scripture, God's big purpose in history is to rescue the nations from their idolatry. And the people of God are commissioned to participate in His rescue plan. This is why in Genesis 12, right after Babel spawns the multitude of the fallen nations, God initiates His redemption plan. In that plan, God calls Abraham and promises him that He would form a new nation through Abraham. This special new organization is comprised of God's commissioned people, and it's called Israel. Once you read Scripture with an organizational lens, then all these connections become clear. The Babel story shows that the fall has taken organizational form. God's redemption must therefore also assume an organizational form as well. And so the people of Israel will be God's organizational tool in His plan for redeeming the Babels of the world. Now, It's so important to remember that God's purpose for his organization, Israel, was always tightly connected to his desire to redeem the nations. In Genesis 17:3, it says, "And God said to him, Abraham, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." God repeats this to Abram's son Isaac in Genesis 26:4 when he says, "And in your offspring, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." God must keep reminding Israel because it seems that God's people tend to forget about this wider calling. For instance, in Isaiah 49:6, God says, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth." This is a sobering reminder that when the people of God get fixated only on their personal redemption or focus exclusively on the state of Christian organizations like the church, they are defining their purpose as too small a thing. Our attention must be bigger and wider than that. We must also attend to our calling to be a light for the nations. The phrase, "a light for the nations," is repeated in Scripture to describe the purpose of God's people. And I think it wonderfully reminds us what our role is and also what it isn't. See, imagine a group imprisoned in a deep and dark dungeon. To be rescued, this group needs an opening to be created. Now, a light cannot create the opening. Some other, much more powerful force must break through and accomplish this from above. In the same way, we, as the light for the nations, cannot accomplish the rescue. We are not responsible to save organizations. Only God can be the true source of rescue. As he declares in Isaiah 49:6, "It is my salvation that reaches to the ends of the earth." However, once the opening to the dungeon has been achieved, a rescue light is needed to point to the opening. This is our role. We are the image pointing to the source. We are meant to illuminate the rescue path. What then does this role really look like? The Old Testament presents two main modes of being a light for the nations. One mode is by God's people modeling what it means to be an organization redeemed by God. Think of this as the beacon on a hill mode. Entire sections of the Old Testament law, such as Leviticus and Numbers, should be read as God instructing Israel on how to organize itself so that its own institutional practices properly image God and then reflect that image from the outside to the nations like a beacon. As we'll see later, the Old Testament scripture describing this beacon on a hill mode is still useful for our organizational lives today. But what I want to focus on now is the second mode of being a light for the nations that's also found in the Old Testament. Think of this second mode as the insider light mode. To illustrate this insider light mode, let me show you a list of names from the Old Testament. If you are even remotely familiar with the Old Testament, you will recognize these names. These are the heroes in the big story of Israel. They're so crucial to Israel's story that, well, the Old Testament would be unrecognizable if you took out these individuals. Do you know what else they all have in common? Each and every one of these individuals were sent by God into the nations. Each and every one, at some point in their lives, wore some organizational hat belonging to what we would now call a secular organization. They were very much on the inside. And what's especially interesting is that many of them initially were not interested in benefiting the nations. Some had their own self-interested reasons for being there. Some were there even against their will. But God led them to ultimately have a profound impact on the nations. In addition to these individuals, whole sections of Israel were sent inside into the nations for long periods of time, and especially against their initial will. These were the periods of exile. Of special note was the Babylonian exile, where Israel would come face to face with that nation's idolatry of Marduk. Now, the most discerning of those exiled individuals, the prophets, they eventually realized that although Israel may not have been initially motivated to enter the nations for the sake of redeeming those institutions, it was God's plan all along. It was God's purpose that they serve as his rescue lights from the inside. Isaiah 42 records this ultimate realization, and this is where my metaphor of the dungeon actually comes from. Isaiah 42, 6-8 has God saying, I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Perhaps you entered your current organization originally for some other motivation, like consumer self-interest. From the inside, you're now starting to diagnose the idolatry that has imprisoned your organization. The good news is God has already broken through and will ultimately complete the rescue. How can we be so certain that God will do this? Because you are there on the inside as his light for the nations. Embracing our commission as a light for the nations means we have a role in God's big plan of redemption. And this means we also have to remind ourselves that God's big plan has reached a particular, and you might say peculiar, stage. As you may recall, theologians call this the already and not yet stage. In one sense, the reconciliation of all things and all institutions that Colossians 1 talks about has already been achieved by Jesus in his death and resurrection. But in another sense, the full implementation of this achievement has not yet happened. And this explains why we still have so many fallen institutions, including yours. The dungeon metaphor from Isaiah 42 can serve as a helpful reminder of this already and not yet dynamic. In Jesus' death and resurrection, the opening to the dungeon has already been achieved. He was that stronger power that broke through. And so those trapped in the dungeon can look up and see that opening and know for certain they have been rescued. However, there is a not yet quality to the situation. The prisoners still must travel some ways to finally reach that opening, and they will need some light to see their way. This metaphor is helpful in setting expectations for your role in your fallen organization. You must realize that you are one particular point of light on that long path. And as one point of light, you are not responsible for illuminating the entire pathway. You are only responsible for where you have been placed. All the twists and turns that lie ahead could be assigned to other points of light. God himself is ultimately responsible for the entire pathway and the final outcome. And God has promised that in the end, he will complete the restoration of all things. No matter how fallen your organization seems to be currently, God has assured us that in the end, he will accomplish this. That hope for God's future is what sustains our current efforts. My favorite Old Testament book is the book of Isaiah, because it is filled with so many beautifully poetic descriptions of this future, final, and completed restoration, when all the nations will be redeemed from their idolatry. The very last chapter of Isaiah, chapter 66, describes this hope for the future. Isaiah 66, verse 18-20 says, "The time is coming to gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory, and I will set a sign among them. And from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away, that they have not heard my fame or seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. In that final day, these institutions will be restored to true images reflecting God's glory, His true character, the fullness of the Trinitarian DNA. We may not see the completed restoration of our organization in our lifetime, but we are promised that it will be achieved in God's final day. Until then, your role is to serve as a light where you've been placed, pointing the way forward to the next step on the path, and to do so with great hope. In this session, we learn that the people of God are called to be lights for the nations by serving as insider lights. The next session will show how Israel was also meant to be God's model organization, like a beacon on a hill. God's instructions for this beacon on the hill mode are found in the Old Testament law. We will then learn something that may be surprising for you. Those instructions from the Old Testament law are also meant to provide practical guidance for our organizational lives today.